They're going to go to fucking federal prison. Federal fucking prison.
They're not just getting suspended, they're going to federal prison. That's the phrase that sent shockwaves through the entire MMA world. When the FBI stepped into the Octagon, it wasn't for a title fight, it was for an investigation that exposed one of the darkest secrets in UFC history. We're talking fight-fixing insider gambling rings and millions of dollars moving quietly behind the scenes. It all started with a single forgettable undercard fight, a matchup most fans barely noticed buried on a random Saturday night. But beneath that cage, a betting storm was already brewing, and by the time the final punch landed, the sport's credibility was hanging by a thread. How did a small-time bout between two mid-tier fighters become the center of a federal investigation? How did odds shift so dramatically that even seasoned bookmakers called it impossible? And most importantly, who knew the outcome before the cage door even closed? As details leaked, the story grew darker. Coaches accused of running secret betting clubs, fighters allegedly wagering against their own teammates, government agencies tracing offshore accounts, and Discord servers filled with thousands of members exchanging insider tips. What started as whispers in gambling forums soon became the biggest scandal the UFC had ever seen. The sport that prided itself on grit, honor, and competition was suddenly facing the one thing no knockout or submission could fix: corruption. This is not just a story about money or fame. It's about trust, the unwritten pact between fighter and fan that every punch thrown is real. But what the FBI discovered behind the Octagon doors would shatter that illusion forever. And it all began on one ordinary night. That turned out to be anything but ordinary. November 5, 2022, UFC Fight Night 214, a card so average that even die-hard fans could barely remember who headlined it. The kind of event you put on in the background, nothing flashy, just another Saturday night of fights. But hidden deep in the prelims was a bout that would change everything: Darrick Minner versus Shailen Nuerdanbieke. Two names most casual fans had never heard of. One a veteran clinging to his spot in the UFC, the other a hungry prospect from China trying to climb the ladder. On paper, it was just another matchup, the kind that comes and goes without headlines. But that night, something strange began to ripple through the betting markets. While fans grabbed beer and popcorn, the betting world went haywire. Within hours of the fight, sportsbooks across the country were hit with a tidal wave of unusual bets, huge wagers pouring in on Nuerdanbieke to win, and not just to win, but to finish the fight in the first round. Odds shifted in real time, jumping from roughly 220 to 450 in a matter of minutes. That's not a small move, that's a financial earthquake.
Fight in particular, the line changed right before the fight from I think the favorite was maybe minus 220 or something like that to then negative 450, which is a 4-1 favorite. And more specifically, it was of a KO in the first round, and it happened in 48 seconds.
Veteran gamblers noticed. Regulators noticed. Even automated systems started flagging irregular activity. Someone somewhere seemed to know something the rest of the world didn't. And then the bell rang. Less than a minute later, it was over. Minner rushed forward, threw a few kicks, and suddenly grimaced his knee, buckling like a snapped wire. Nuerdanbieke pounced, finishing him with strikes in just 48 seconds. The fight ended exactly the way those last-minute bets predicted. Coincidence? Maybe once. But not with millions of dollars on the line. Because those odds didn't move by accident, they moved for a reason. In the world of sports, betting numbers tell stories long before headlines do. And on that November night, the numbers were screaming. Within hours of Darrick Minner stepping into the cage, sportsbooks across the country began lighting up with warnings. Unusual betting activity. Heavy money suddenly flooding one side. And not just any kind of bet wager specifically predicting that Shailen Nuerdanbieke would win in the first round. That detail was what made analysts' jaws drop. It wasn't a balanced wave of casual bets, it was a precision strike. Hundreds of thousands of dollars poured in, all targeting the same unlikely scenario. Within minutes, odds that once sat around 220 exploded to 450. For context, that's the kind of shift you only see when a superstar pulls out at the last second, not when two mid-tier fighters are about to scrap in the prelims. Professional bookmakers know volatility, but this was different. This was a pattern. Every algorithm designed to flag suspicious behavior began to chirp like a smoke alarm. Veteran gamblers posted on forums saying something was off as if the outcome was already written. Regulators from organizations like US Integrity were pinged before the fight even began, warning that insider information may be influencing the line. For anyone familiar with how betting markets work, those numbers don't lie. Lines that move this violently don't happen organically, they happen when someone knows something the public doesn't. And sure enough, less than a minute into the fight, the exact bet first-round finish cashed out flawlessly. Millions shifted hands that night. Sportsbooks lost faith, the UFC lost face, and law enforcement took notice. Because if the odds were this precise, that meant something far worse than luck was at play. And someone did know. When the cage door shut, no one expected what was about to unfold. Darrick Minner looked tense, almost hesitant, not the usual composed veteran fans had seen before. The first kick he threw told the story before the commentators could. His knee buckled instantly. Pain flashed across his face. In just seconds, it was clear something was wrong. Shailan Nurdanbika did what any fighter would do. He swarmed. A quick barrage of punches and elbows, and within 48 seconds, the referee stepped in. It was over. Just like that. 48 seconds, the exact scenario bettors had predicted right down to the first round finish. To casual viewers, it looked like an unfortunate injury, the kind that happens in MMA all the time. But to people watching the betting markets, this wasn't bad luck. It was confirmation. The improbable bets had just paid off with surgical precision. The timing was too perfect, the odds too specific, the money too well placed. Within minutes, sportsbooks went into meltdown. Betting companies froze, accounts halted payouts, and started investigating the flood of first-round wagers. Regulators' phones began ringing. Something about the fight didn't add up. The Nevada State Athletic Commission took notice, and U.S. Integrity, a watchdog group that monitors gambling patterns, flagged the match for review before the night was even over. On social media, rumors spread like wildfire. Inside info, fixed fight, coaches leaking injuries. Fans didn't know what to believe, but one thing was certain: this wasn't normal. Somewhere between the moment Minner's knee gave out and Nurdanbika's hand was raised, the UFC's image took a direct hit. And as the whispers turned into headlines, investigators followed the trail of money messages and gym connections. All roads led to one man: James Krause. For years, James Krause was the kind of name MMA fans mentioned with quiet respect. A tough veteran who had fought in multiple promotions before carving out a second life as one of the UFC's most respected coaches. He ran Glory MMA and Fitness in Missouri, a gym known for producing sharp, disciplined fighters. Inside the community, Krause was viewed as a tactician, a strategist, a guy who lived and breathed the fight game. But behind that reputation, another side of him was growing, one that would eventually destroy everything he built. Krause wasn't just coaching, he was betting. And not in the harmless weekend gambler sense. He had become deeply embedded in the underground of MMA wagering. Through his online group called the 1% Club, Krause hosted a private Discord and YouTube channel where he shared fight predictions, betting strategies, and so-called insider reads. Thousands joined, paying monthly fees to access what he called expert knowledge. But this wasn't your average sports analysis. Krause's tips were eerily accurate, and soon people started asking why. What made his advice so profitable wasn't analytics, it was access. As a coach with direct connections to fighters, training camps, and injuries, Krause lived in the very ecosystem where secrets were currency. He allegedly turned that inside information into betting gold, walking a dangerous tightrope between legitimate coaching and potential match manipulation. And while sports betting had just been legalized across much of the US, the UFC's stance was clear: no fighter coach or insider should be placing bets on UFC events, ever. Krause didn't just bend that rule, he built a business around breaking it. Then came November 5th, 2022, a fight his gym was directly involved in, and one of his fighters just happened to be Darrick Minner. Glory MMA had once been seen as a symbol of everything right about the sport: grit, unity, and brotherhood. But in the months after that November fight, it became something else entirely: ground zero for a gambling scandal that threatened to poison the UFC from the inside out. James Krause wasn't just Darrick Minner's coach, he was the architect of the entire system that surrounded him. Fighters trusted Krause not only with their training, but in many cases with their finances. He had the kind of influence most coaches could only dream of, and he knew it. Within Glory's walls, Krause's side business, the 1% Club, wasn't a secret. Fighters discussed bets, outcomes, and even injuries that hadn't been made public. That insider information: who was hurt, who had a bad camp, who was struggling to make weight, became fuel for the underground betting ring. It went deeper than Discord messages. Federal investigators later uncovered links between Krause and an offshore sportsbook called abcbetting.ag, where he allegedly acted as an agent, taking and placing bets for others. Fighters, gym associates, even friends of friends, anyone who trusted Krause's word could get in on the action. The deeper you were in Glory MMA, the closer you were to the real money. By the time sportsbooks noticed the suspicious betting patterns on the Minner fight, Glory MMA wasn't just a gym anymore. It was a network, a web of fighters, bettors, and insiders, all orbiting around Krause's growing empire. What had started as harmless analysis had evolved into something darker, a system of exploiting injuries and confidential gym information for profit. And inside that same gym was another rising star, a young, talented fighter who would soon find himself caught in the storm. And that's where another name entered the scandal: Jeff Molina. Jeff Molina was supposed to be the next big thing, young, talented, and confident without the arrogance the kind of fighter fans love to root for. He had the flashy striking, the social media charm, and a growing reputation as one of the UFC's most promising flyweight prospects. But behind that polished image was a secret that would pull him straight into the center of the storm James Krause had unleashed.
Molina was UFC's Jeff Molina suspended for alleged substantial involvement in ongoing James Krause investigation. Substantial.
Yeah, he was on, I've heard a thing that he was on his Discord, and he said that, like, Jeff Molina said that, like, you know, I paid my mortgage, my house, my phone bill, everything with this Discord right here. Make sure you guys join it. So he was pushing it hard.
Molina wasn't just a student at Glory MMA. He was one of Krause's closest proteges. He trained under him, traveled with him, and as it would turn out, followed him into the dark world of insider betting. Investigators later revealed that Molina was an active member of Krause's 1% Club Discord group, where bets weren't just discussed, they were coordinated. And Molina wasn't shy about it. In one video clip circulated online, he bragged that the Discord had helped him pay his mortgage, his phone bill, and everything else. It wasn't just extra cash, it had become a side hustle, a financial lifeline. But what made Molina's involvement so explosive was one specific accusation he allegedly placed bets on the Minner fight, the same fight where his injured teammate stepped into the cage knowing he could barely stand. Reports claim Molina knew about Minner's knee injury before the bout and used that knowledge to wager on Nuerdenbeke to win, essentially betting against his own teammate. To fans, it felt like betrayal. To regulators, it was a flashing red alarm, a textbook case of insider trading but in the world of sports. Molina's public persona as the charismatic underdog quickly shattered. He wasn't just part of the team anymore, he was part of the evidence. And when the walls closed in, the fallout was brutal. When the smoke cleared, the UFC had no choice but to act fast. The scandal had already gone. Public headlines were exploding across ESPN gambling forums and Reddit. Fans were demanding answers, sportsbooks were freezing accounts, and regulators were circling. For Dana White and the UFC brass, silence was no longer an option. The first hammer dropped on Darrick Minner. He wasn't just suspended, he was cut outright. His UFC career ended overnight, his name permanently tied to one of the biggest gambling controversies the sport had ever seen. The message from the promotion was clear: zero tolerance. Anyone caught up in this mess would be gone. No negotiations, no second chances. Next came the bigger move: James Krause. The UFC didn't just ban him from coaching, they erased him from the sport. Krause was prohibited from cornering fighters, entering events, or participating in any official UFC activity. But the ban didn't stop with him. The organization blacklisted his entire gym, Glory MMA and Fitness. Fighters associated with Krause were told they couldn't compete unless they found a new camp. That announcement hit like a bomb. Overnight, Glory MMA, once one of the most respected fight teams in America, became radioactive. Talented athletes like Brandon Royval, Megan Anderson, and others were forced to pack up and find new training homes. Friendships fractured, careers stalled, and fighters who had nothing to do with the scandal were suddenly paying the price for their coaches' actions. Behind the scenes, whispers spread that the UFC wasn't acting alone. Regulators were cooperating. Phone records, betting slips, offshore accounts, everything was being examined. Because what had started as a suspicious betting pattern was now something much larger. This was no longer a UFC problem. The FBI had entered the chat. When the FBI steps into sports, it's never casual. It means someone somewhere crossed a line that leads into federal territory, and in late 2022, that line pointed straight at James Krause. Working alongside US Integrity, a firm specializing in tracking irregular betting data, federal agents began quietly collecting everything. Betting slips, financial transfers, encrypted messages, Discord logs, even offshore sportsbook records. What they found suggested something much more organized than a few fighters placing casual bets. Authorities suspected a coordinated network, one that could fall under serious federal crimes like wire fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy. The betting patterns were too consistent, the timing too perfect, and the money trail too deep. Krause's role as both a coach and gambling broker blurred legal boundaries. If he accepted wagers or profited from insider information that wasn't just unethical, it was criminal. For months, whispers of an impending raid and sealed indictments circulated through the MMA world. Reporters pressed Dana White for answers, but his tone was sharp and cold. At a press conference, when asked what would happen to anyone caught fixing fights or leaking insider info, White didn't hesitate. They'll go to federal prison. Federal prison.
People are asking me, well, what were they talking about? Somebody was saying, well, what's the UFC going to do? We let these guys know not to bet on fights. Do you know what the outcome of this is? Like, if I penalize them, you get cut. They're going to go to fucking federal prison. Federal prison.
That line echoed across social media. The UFC president wasn't just distancing himself, he was warning everyone watching that this scandal was bigger than the organization. The FBI had jurisdiction now, and people could actually go to jail. But as the months passed, something strange happened. Despite all the investigations, no arrests came. No handcuffs, no court dates, no headlines declaring closure. And in that silence, questions began to grow louder. Because while Dana White pointed fingers outward, many inside the MMA world started wondering, was the UFC itself as innocent as it claimed to be? To understand why a scandal like this could even happen, you have to look deeper than the headlines. You have to look at the money, or more accurately, the lack of it. In the UFC, not every fighter is living the McGregor dream. For every millionaire on pay-per-view, there are dozens barely scraping by. Entry-level contracts often pay just $10,000 to show and $10,000 to win. On paper, that might sound decent until you subtract everything a fighter has to pay just to step inside the cage. Training camps can cost between $20,000 and $50,000. Fighters pay coaches, nutritionists, sparring partners, management, and taxes. By the time the fight's over, many walk away with less than half their purse. That means some fighters are literally losing money to fight professionally on the biggest stage in the world. Unlike the NFL or NBA, where athletes receive roughly 50% of league revenue, UFC fighters earn only 16 to 20%. And because they're classified as independent contractors, they don't get health insurance, pensions, or job security. If they get injured, and most do, there's no paycheck waiting, just medical bills and silence. It's no wonder whispers of unionization have circulated for years. Lawsuits like Lever Zuffa have challenged the UFC's power, arguing that fighters are trapped in unfair contracts. Groups like the MMA Fighters Association have tried to organize change, but fear runs deep. Speak up too loudly and you risk getting cut. For many, gambling became a tempting shortcut, a risky way to make up for what the system refused to give. When a single bet could pay more than a fight, the moral line starts to blur. And while fighters struggled to survive, fans weren't buying the excuses anymore. They demanded answers. When the scandal hit the mainstream, the internet erupted. Reddit threads exploded overnight. Twitter, or X as it's now called, flooded with outrage memes and disbelief. Fans weren't just angry at the fighters involved. They were furious at what they saw as UFC hypocrisy. On one hand, the promotion plastered betting sponsors everywhere, logos on banners, odds, on broadcasts, entire segments dedicated to gambling analysis. The UFC had practically turned Fight Night into a sportsbook commercial. But when fighters got caught up in the same system the company promoted, they were immediately punished. To fans, it felt like the organization wanted the profits of the betting boom without owning the consequences. Reddit's RRMMA subreddit became the front line of the outrage. Longtime fans posted betting data charts, injury rumors, and timelines dissecting every piece of the scandal like detectives. "You can't market gambling every week," one comment read, then act shocked when fighters start playing the same game. Others were darker, claiming the UFC might have known about Krause's gambling connections long before the FBI ever did, and only cut him off once regulators got involved. Memes flooded timelines. Dana White photoshopped into an FBI interrogation room. James Krause dubbed the Wolf of Fight Street. Some joked that Krause was running the first FightFlix original series, breaking odds. But beneath the humor was real frustration, the sense that the sport's integrity had been quietly sold off piece by piece. Conspiracy theories grew too. Fans speculated about deeper corruption, judge manipulation, or hidden payouts. And as the months dragged on with no arrests, the outrage only intensified. The scandal was no longer just about a coach, a fighter, or a Discord group, it was about trust. And even the regulators couldn't ignore the noise. By 2025, the dust had mostly settled, at least on the surface. But beneath the calm, the scandal's echo refused to fade. The Nevada State Athletic Commission finally issued its rulings, putting an official stamp on what the MMA community already knew: careers had been destroyed. Derek Minner received a 2-year retroactive suspension and a small fine, just $200, for failing to disclose his knee injury before the fight. It was a symbolic punishment. His UFC career had already ended, but the record would forever carry that mark, a quiet reminder of the night that changed everything. Jeff Molina got it worse. 3 years, a $235 fine. His suspension was longer because regulators concluded he not only bet on the Minner fight, but also misled investigators in the early stages. For a fighter who once seemed destined for stardom, it was a brutal fall, 3 years in exile, watching the sport move on without him. And then there was James Krause. His punishment wasn't measured in months or fines, it was indefinite. His coaching license revoked, His name effectively blacklisted from the sport he helped build. Glory MMA was finished, and so was he. The shockwaves even crossed borders. Canadian provinces like Ontario and Alberta temporarily suspended all UFC betting citing integrity concerns. For a sport already walking a tightrope between competition and commerce, that was catastrophic. Betting was one of the UFC's biggest revenue drivers, and now regulators were saying they didn't trust it. Yet for all the headlines, one thing never came: arrests. No indictments, no court cases, no perp walks. Nearly 3 years later, the FBI investigation remains active but silent. And in that silence, as fighters returned, fans moved on, and memories faded, that silence became louder than any statement. The UFC would never be the same again. What began as a single fight on a forgettable card ended up rewriting the rulebook for an entire sport. In the aftermath, new policies were drafted overnight. Fighters, coaches, and even family members were banned from betting on UFC events. Partnerships with watchdog groups like US Integrity were strengthened, and gambling activity was monitored in real time. But the damage was already done. The public's trust had been shaken to its core. The scandal forced the fight world to confront an uncomfortable truth. The line between competition and corruption was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. When money, pain, and desperation collide, honor becomes negotiable. The UFC learned that the hard way, and while stricter rules now exist, rules alone can't repair what was lost belief. Fans began to question everything. Every quick finish, every strange judging scorecard, every sudden injury. Forums filled with skepticism. Even clean fighters found themselves under suspicion, trapped in a sport where one man's greed had infected everyone's faith. And this wasn't just an MMA problem. The same year, the NBA and several other leagues faced their own betting scandals. The message was clear: legalized gambling had changed sports forever. Integrity now had a price tag, and the cost was rising. Still, the biggest question lingers like a shadow over the Octagon. If one small fight could expose this much darkness, what else lies beneath? How many secrets, how many close calls have gone unnoticed? Because sometimes the biggest stories aren't about the punches we see, but the ones we never do. So what do you think? Was this true justice or just another cover-up in disguise? Comment your thoughts below and stay tuned, because this story is far from over.